Hi, let's say you know a couple of good looking kids who want to get married. Trouble is, one's a Christian and the other is not. Is this perfectly fine because love is love? Or is this unwise? Or is this sin? Here's what seniors at Timothy Christian said just 4 years ago. This year, the numbers are reversed, actually. I think the reason for the confusion is this passage was given to you as the go-to passage. If a woman has a husband who's not a believer and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him, Paul says. For the unbelieving husband's been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Let's answer this question about sanctification here. This is confusing to many students when they read this. It's like, what is Paul saying here? Is he saying that this spouse is actually saved because of the other spouse's beliefs? Well, that obviously is confusing because that doesn't seem to be consistent with much of anything else in the New Testament. And so let's take a look at that word sanctification. To be set apart, to be made holy, has two basic meanings that you'll see in the New Testament. The first one, to morally improve, for example. And the other one is to be set apart positionally as in terms of salvation. We're talking about the first one here, that an unbelieving spouse is going to be positively influenced by their believing spouse. Paul goes on to say, how do you know whether you'll save your husband? How do you know whether you'll save your wife? So there he's using the word save, which indicates that when he's talking about sanctification, he's not talking about salvation. He's talking about this first definition. It does work out sometimes, right? Paul says, don't force yourselves to remain married if the other one wants to leave, because you might save them. Paul says, nevertheless, each one should retain the place in life that the Lord has assigned, to which God has called him. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? Then he should not become uncircumcised. And then he goes on to say, was a man uncircumcised when he was called? Then he should not become circumcised. Here Paul, of course, is making a joke, because in those days they did not have the technology to get uncircumcised. To put the foreskin back on. They didn't have that technology. I don't even know if we have that technology today. But Paul's point here is, the overriding principle is retain the place in life that you had when God called you. When you did become a Christian, right? When you were saved, what was your position in life? That's why I think in context, Paul is talking about people who are already married. Were you already married when you became a Christian? Then don't just, seek a divorce with your unbelieving spouse, because it might work out. But Paul is not in this passage talking about whom you should marry. It's talking about whether you should leave somebody you're already married to. So that's why 1 Corinthians 7 ends with some rules about divorce and remarriage, but only in the Lord. That phrase, only in the Lord, suggests that person be a Christian. I don't know what else that phrase would mean. In his second letter to the Corinthians, to clear up any of the confusion perhaps from his first letter, and that is, he says, just, do not be yoked together. Marriage is not about, two people staring each other in the face and kissing or just reciting love poems. That romance is part of it. But we're called to be together and work together as married couples. Like, most of your marriage is not this, kissing and having sex. Most of marriage is doing work together, and that's the work that God's called us to. We're to do the work of the kingdom. And if your spouse is not on board with the work of the kingdom or Jesus the King, it's going to be very difficult doing the work of the kingdom. And that's why Paul says, don't be unequally yoked. While we're on the topic of marriage, let's talk about leadership. The complementarian view is that there are different roles and the male should lead. The egalitarian is equal leadership, mutual submission. One of the key passages is from Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul has been talking about following God's example as dearly loved children, walking in the way of love, loving the way that Jesus loves. Do not get drunk, he says. Sing and make music from your heart, etc. Then he says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he says, wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. And then he says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. If you are a complementarian, what is the key lines or phrases that you are going to highlight? Well, it's going to be that wives should submit to their husbands, that husbands are the head. If you are an egalitarian, what are you going to point out? This little statement here. This statement here seems to be a segue from what Paul has been talking about, which is church community, and then he talks specifically about marital relationships. The question is, where does that sentence belong? Does it belong above or below or kind of right in the middle, like this particular version puts it? Paul did not write in paragraphs. The originals were not paragraphed, so we don't know where it was supposed to be, and interpreters try to make that decision. Getting back to this question, who rules? Well, first, who rules the body? If you're a dude, who rules your body? If you're a woman, who rules your body when you're married? Paul says the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. That's sex. And likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but, boom, the wife does. Maybe you're thinking like me, so what? What's the difference between a wife having authority over her husband and vice versa versus I'm just having authority over myself? Well, I think the key difference here is sort of this very core perspective that Christians are supposed to have about control and power and authority. And authority belongs to God, obviously, but then we also submit to one another. We give up the right to make our own decisions as Christians. We submit ourselves to a process, to God ultimately, but also to one another. So, getting back to this question of who rules in marriage, the complementarians, of course, highlight the fact that husbands love and wives submit. The egalitarians highlight the submit to one another. I do want to point out that if you're going to give yourself up as a husband for your wife, this involves servant leadership. And this is a very common phrase that is used by both groups. This is like Jesus washing his disciples' feet. This is like a husband doing the dishes. This is doing the menial servant-type tasks. Jesus did those things. Husbands, if you're going to love your wives like Christ did, you need to be willing to humble yourself. And so if you believe in that, and I hope you do believe in servant leadership, that we don't take advantage of our authority, I submit that mutual submission is not just an egalitarian thing. If I'm a complementarian, I need to believe in mutual submission. Clearly, it's in Ephesians 5 as something we're all to do to one another in the church, right? But I think that goes for church leaders as well. I think it goes for my own boss. You know, the principal is not the kind of leader that just tells everybody what to do and then they all have to obey or submit or whatever. But rather is one who listens to what everybody has to say, and a good leader, I think, does submit to others at the appropriate times. If my marriage is a complementarian one, where I'm the male leader, then I can mutually submit to my wife. So in other words, an egalitarian and a complementarian marriage, if they're doing it right, they shouldn't look all that different.